Namaskaraha. Welcome to JyotishShastram. We learnt more about Varahamihira in the previous episode and how he shaped the evolution of JyotishShastram. In today's episode, we will see a few key personalities who took the JyotishShastram development to the next level. Ardent followers of JyotishShastram will be familiar with their names and books. To quote a few famous works, Muhurta Chinthamani, Uttara Kalamrita, etc. Let's learn about them. As we look back into the 6th century, the first person to talk about right after Varahamihira would be his son Prithuyassasu. Varahamihira was well versed in all three divisions of JyotishShastram, but his son Prithuyassasu focused his expertise mainly in Hora or predictive JyotishShastram. He simplified Varahamihira's book on Hora and wrote a book called Hora Sara. He wrote another well-known book called Shat Panchashika. In the same century, you see another famous personality called Kalyanavarma. He was a king from a place called Devagrama in present Gujarat. He was also an expert in Hora and wrote an elaborate book with 2,500 poems, even bigger than Varahamihira's Brihad Jataka. This book is Saravali. Experts say that this book is even clearer than Varahamihira's book and contains elaborate details related to every aspect of a person's life. Moving on to the 7th century, we see a shift to Siddhanta or astronomical part of JyotishShastram. A great stalwart, the world famous mathematician and astronomy expert called Brahmagupta. He was from Bhinmal in Rajasthan but eventually moved to Ujjain and headed the famous observatory. His works are Brahmasputa Siddhanta Grantha and Khandakadya Karana Grantha. These books contain a combination of maths and JyotishShastram. Maths and JyotishShastram went hand in hand, which rightly was researched and learnt by our ancestors. I feel that's the reason they progressed in it so much so that we remember their contributions even now after 1300 years. He is praised world over for his contribution in all fields of math such as trigonometry, geometry, etc. A few examples. The formula for the area of the cyclic quadrilateral is called Brahmagupta's theorem all over the world. Although it may seem obvious to us now that 0 is a number, Brahmagupta was the first person in history to define the properties of the number 0. 1 plus 0 is 1, 1 into 0 is 0, 1 minus 0 is 1, and 1 divided by 0 is 0. Bhaskara II carried forward Brahmagupta's work and corrected 1 divided by 0 as undefined. Dwadasha Shatabdham Bhaskaracharyah tam Ganakachakra Chudamanihi. Bhaskaracharya addressed him as jewel among the circle of mathematicians. It's unfortunate that we didn't learn as much about Brahmagupta in school as much as people abroad learn about his contributions. Similarly, specific to JyotishShastram, Brahmagupta gave a lot of advanced theories and helped in the progress of the science. He detailed eclipses, calculation of solar year, and even spoke about gravity. The historian of science George Sarton called him one of the greatest scientists of his race and the greatest of his time. In the 8th century, Siddhanta and Hora were given importance by Lallacharya. His book in Siddhanta, Shishyadhi Vruddhidam Tantra, and in Hora is called Jyotisha Ratnakosha. An example, he explains the calculation of the present time using a yantra called Ghatika Yantra, which could tell the time better than a sundial, that is, even on a cloudy day. In the 10th century, we see a famous personality who was well versed in all three divisions of JyotishShastram. He was a scholar from Kashmir called Bhattotpala. His famous works in Siddhanta are Rahunnakarana and Karanapata, in Samhita, Prashnagnanam, Shakunashastram, and Ramalasaram. He not only spread knowledge through his books, but was also the only scholar who gave expert commentary on many important JyotishShastram books, such as Varahamihira's books. Prithuyassasu Shat Panchashika, and Brahmagupta's Khandakhadyaka. 11th century again saw scholars well versed in all three divisions of JyotishShastram. Sripathi is renowned for his expertise, which is seen through his works. In Siddhanta, he wrote Siddhanta Shekaraha, Dhikoti Karanam on eclipses, Parti Ganitam, and a few more. In Hora, he wrote Jataka Paddhati, Ramala Paddhati, and gave a new system called Sripati Bhava Paddhati, which is followed by a lot of scholars even now. In Samhita, his book is Ratnamala Grantha. The contemporary of Sripati is the great, knowledgeable, and generous king Bhojaraj. He was the king of Dharanagar from the Paramar dynasty. Did you know that Bhopal is named after him? There is so much of history with respect to his good work, contributions in pretty much every field, such as chemistry, hydraulics, yoga, Ayurveda, etc. The list is never ending. You wouldn't be surprised now if I say that he has written 84 books. All his books were famous. To name a few, Raja Martanda, a major commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and literary works such as Champu Ramayanam, which is believed that he wrote it overnight. His famous books in Jyotish Shastram, specifically in Siddhanta, are Raja Mruganka and Aditya Pratapa Siddhanta. In Hora, Vidvajjana Vallabha, and in Samhita, Ramalaratna Prabhuti. Bhaskaracharya or Bhaskara II was from the same period. We already saw a detailed account in episode 13. Please take a look at that episode if you're interested. In this century, the king of Mithila, Ballalasena, whose Samhita book called Adbhuta Sagara was renowned. It is told that he died before he could finish the book and entrusted the responsibility to his son Lakshmanasena, who eventually completed it. 13th century saw four important people: the famous Kalidasa, who wrote Jyotir Vidhabharanam, related to Samhita. This describes Muhurta calculation for every event, be it major or minor. A little detail for you all. Did you know that there are three Kalidasas in Indian history? Mahakavi Kalidasa, known for Sanskrit literary works, was the first Kalidasa and from an earlier time. Kalidasa too is the person who has written Jyotir Vidhabharanam and was from the 13th century. We will see Kalidasa III as well later in this episode when we cover 17th century and whose famous book was Uttara Kalamritam. After Kalidasa, we see Keshavarkaha, who contributed to Samhita and Siddhanta through Vivaha Vrindavanam and Karanakanthi. Markandeya Bhattadri, or popularly known as Mantreswara, he introduced himself in this verse. Shri Shalivati Jatena Maya Mantreshwarena Vai Daivagnena Dvijagrena Satam Jyotirvidam Mude. A Keralian Nambudri Brahmin from Tirunelveli. He wrote a famous Hora book called Phaladipika, where he gave an exhaustive list of Graha Karakattvas or characteristics of every planet, which runs into pages. He is compared to the likes of Parashara. It is interesting to note how he sought this knowledge. He was a Devi Upasaka, stayed at Badrika Ashrama, Himalayas, and Mithila. Due to this continuous vratas, dikshas, and upavasas, he was called Mantreshwara and eventually acquired lot of knowledge in Jyotish Shastram. He apparently was a successful yogi who lived for 150 years. We also see Padmanabha Suri's contribution to Hora through his work Bhuvana Deepakam or Grahabhava Prakasham. Going forward, we notice a gain of interest and love for Phalita Jyotisham or predictive Jyotish Shastram. Vidvannarayana, or popularly called as Bhattanarayana, was from Maharashtra, who settled in Mysore, wrote a famous Hora book called Chamatkara Chinthamani, also called Bhava Chinthamani. A Hora scholar from Warangal, Andhra, who wrote the famous Jataka Parijata, introduces himself in this verse. Bharadvaja Kulodbhavasya Vidushaha Sri Venkatadreriha JyotishShastram Visharadasya Tanayaha Sri Vaidyanatha Sudhihi Horasara Sudharasagna Vibhuda Shreni Manaha Pritaye Rashistana Nirupanadi Sakalam Vakshye Yathanukramam. Jataka Parijata is a renowned book and has quite a few commentaries on it as well. In this century, other than Makaranda, who wrote about Siddhanta in Makaranda Grantha, the other three were Hora scholars Punjaraju, Venkatesha Daivagna, and Dhundhiraju. Followers of JyotishShastram would know the famous book Sarvartha Chinthamani, written by Venkatesha Daivagna. 15th century also saw the emergence of a renowned family whose contribution to JyotishShastram is significant and spans across centuries until the 17th century. The legacy starts with Daivagna Shiromani Chinthamani, who hailed from Dharmapura Nagara in Maharashtra. He was an expert in Siddhanta, Hora, and Samhita. In the 16th century, his son Ananta Daivagna, also a JyotishShastram expert, wrote a book in Hora called Jataka Paddhati. His two sons, Neelakantha and Rama Daivagna, also carried forward the family legacy. Neelakantha wrote a book on Hora called Tajika Neelakanthi. Rama Daivagna wrote the famous book on Muhurta called Muhurta Chintamani in Varanasi. He named it after his grandfather Chinthamani. This is a renowned book known as the basis for most of the Muhurta calculations and taught in many universities even now. He also wrote Rama Vinoda and Todarananda. Neelakantha's son, Govinda Daivagna, in the 17th century wrote a valuable commentary on Muhurta Chintamani called Piyushadhara Tika. We took a deviation into Chinthamani Daivagna's family history and had left off at 15th century. Coming back to 16th century, we see other scholars such as Ganesha Daivagna and Narayana. Ganesha Daivagna's contribution was significant in all three areas of JyotishShastram. His own composition spans 13 books and also gave valuable commentaries on his predecessors' books such as Siddhanta Shiromani. 17th century saw around 11 famous scholars. A few focused on a single area such as Hora or Samhita or Siddhanta, whereas a few like Vishwanatha were experts in all three areas of JyotishShastram. Siddhanta scholars were Kamalakara Bhatta, Jagannatha, King Jayasimha, Ranganatha, and his son Munishwara. Hora saw scholars such as Mallari, Ganesha's Jataka Alankara, and Kalidasa III. Remember, we spoke of three Kalidasas earlier? Kalidasa III here wrote the famous Uttara Kalamrita. Samhita scholars were Mahadeva and Ganapati. A special mention on Vishwanatha, whom I said earlier was an expert in all three areas. He is also called as Bhattotpala II, as he wrote numerous commentaries on famous books such as Brihad Jataka, Brihad Samhita, Tajaka Neelakanthi, and many more. We end with 19th century with a contribution of Manasagar through his book on Hora called Manasagari. To summarize, we saw the rich history of JyotishShastram span across 1300 years, starting from 6th century until the 19th century. We learnt about significant contributors in every century. These 38 scholars, if you remember, came after Varahamihira. Here's a compilation of their books in each division of JyotishShastram that we already saw in this episode. This is the list of important books in Siddhanta. Please pause if you would like to take a closer look. Here's the list in Hora. I have compiled this list for your quick reference. And finally, the list in Samhita. The significance of JyotishShastram is clearly visible in every century from the evidences that we see. These scholars have left us with a treasure of knowledge. The least we should do is recognize their contribution and, if possible, learn and expand this knowledge. Today's episode would have given you an idea of the important books that any learner of JyotishShastram should definitely be aware of. In the next episode, which will be the last of the series of the key personalities and evolution of JyotishShastram, we will learn how Jains have contributed to JyotishShastram. Thanks for watching. Do subscribe to this free channel and support the cause of spreading JyotishShastram knowledge to everyone. Dhanyavadaha.